We are now entering what I call the chessboard phase. This red oak and epoxy light-up chessboard was my first chess set build. Stay tuned for the build process and lots of learnings, meaning failures that you can learn from. Welcome to Howdies. I started with some really pretty curly red oak and cut it into 2 by 2 inch squares. I cut an MDF base and covered it with clear packing tape to attach the squares to. I glued all the squares down onto the chessboard pattern and built a frame out of some spare wood, also putting clear packing tape on the exterior. Basically, wherever the epoxy would touch the wood, I covered it in clear packing tape. To assure the epoxy would not leak, I used silicone around the sides and the corners, which does a great job holding in the epoxy. Hint: you do not need much silicone. If your silicone is uneven or bumpy or sticks out in any way, the epoxy will mirror that shape. I mixed up some clear epoxy and poured a small layer into each square. The plan was to use the epoxy to cover each oak square to close the pores and avoid the epoxy nightmare: bubbles. Unfortunately, I did not properly prepare the oak. Even the small layer of epoxy I used was still deep enough to cause bubbles to start pouring out of the pores of the oak. When I tried to pop them with a propane torch, it simply heated the wood and it heated the epoxy, and the bubbles got worse and worse. Another issue I noticed was the packing tape on the bottom was not flat enough and came off of the wood base. This created ripples in the bottom of the piece. Now, although these would later be sanded down, if you are trying to create a smooth piece, just be aware that the clear packing tape may create ripples unless it stays down. With the bubbles, I decided to mix up a whitish batch of epoxy for the next layer. The idea would be that this semi-opaque layer would hide some of the bubbles and still maintain the opacity for the light to come through. I chose Soma from Eye Candy. Eye Candy is a maker of pigments, and they sell a lot online on Amazon.com. I highly recommend them. Their pigments are excellent. They're not one of the lower priced and they're not one of the highest priced, but they make great quality stuff. I mixed up the epoxy and poured it into each clear square, using a swirl motion as it started to dry to get the effect that I wanted. Once dry, I removed the piece from the frame. I used my table saw and table saw sled, which you'll probably notice is ginormous because I built it to hold larger pieces for cutting boards and chessboards, to cut off the excess on the edge and to clean the board up. I then ran it through the drum sander multiple times, the very slow drum sander, until it was relatively smooth on the top and the bottom, and then sealed the wood with a coat of shellac. Next was prepping for the epoxy top coat. I put blue tape down on a piece of MDF to serve as my frame, and also put matching tape on the underside of the board. CA glue was used to attach the board to the frame. I built the sides of the frame out of spare pieces of wood I had lying around, and, as I did the first time around, used clear packing tape to cover any part of the frame that would contact the epoxy. As before, silicone was used to connect the frame together. The last thing you want is epoxy spilling everywhere onto your countertop, onto your workstation, onto your garage floor. After a quick mix and pour of the top coat of epoxy and 24 hours to dry, I removed the board from the frame and again cleaned up the edges to be straight on the table saw. For the board edging, I cut 4 strips of poplar to the exact width of the board and glued them on using alternating glues. CA glue was used where the edge would come in contact with the epoxy, and Titebond wood glue was used where the edge would meet the wood squares. This made sure that no dried yellow wood glue would be visible through the opaque epoxy squares. I then trimmed the edging of the board and set the board aside. On to the frame. Since this was my first board, I decided to just make the frame out of some 2x4s from a big box store. This was great because it was cheap and it would really test my abilities to make a 90-degree cut from a curved piece of wood. I failed that, by the way. I cut 4 strips of 2x4, leaving room to cut down the corners later. The plan was to add a bottom board using eraser board, which could then store the chess pieces once complete. I measured the width of the eraser board and cut a groove in each of the 2x4s with that precise width. These will serve as a slot for the eraser board once glued up. I marked the inside, outside, and the planned cut for each 2x4. I know you think I will remember that this was supposed to be the inside of this edging, but you won't, so just mark it now. Using a digital measure, I set my table saw to 45-degree angle. Just a note, these digital angle finders are great and one of my most used tools. I even use them as a level for all of my projects. However, I should have first measured whether the table saw top was level, meaning at 0 degrees. If, for example, my garage was not level and my saw was at a 2-degree incline, this would make what looked like a 45-degree angle to be 2 degrees off. Anyways, back to the project. I cut the first 45 angles on all 4 sides, making sure to watch where the inside of each piece was and checking as I went along. I measured the side of my chessboard and cut the frame to be just under that width. This way, I can add a groove at the top and the board will slide down and sit in the frame, but it'll still be flush with the frame. Hint, if you are trying to line up a marked line on your wood with the blade of your table saw, you can use a straight edge against the blade and draw a line to mark on your table saw where you need to run it along. Once complete, I laid out the 4 sections of the frame and placed my board over the top. Here I could measure the depth of the groove to cut out so that my board would drop into the frame. I set my blade depth to the same depth of my chessboard and set the distance from the outside of the blade to the fence to cut out enough wood to allow the board to drop in. For the eraser board bottom, I cut the square of the eraser board to fit the frame, taking into account that the board would be bigger than the inside of the frame itself, since it would need the additional space to fit into the groove. Next, I cut 2 approximately 1/2 inch wide, 1/8 inch deep grooves into the inside of each 2x4 edge. This is where I will insert the lights later. Since I did not have a dado blade, I simply used my regular blade and inched it over a little for each pass. After taping the outside of the frame, I spray painted the inside of the frame pieces all white to try and make the lights more visible. Once dried, it was time to glue up the frame. There are lots of great methods to assure that you have a good 45-degree corner and you glue them together perfectly. I used none of those methods on this board. Instead, I tried to clamp the board with a juice groove jig I made for my cutting boards. Oh well, I'll show you how I fixed that later. When the glue was dried, it was time to add the light strips. I purchased them off Amazon, and you can find a ton of options there. Showing that my errors are not just limited strictly to working with wood, I didn't realize that the red strip on the back of those strip lights came off to reveal an adhesive. Instead, I glued the strip to the board itself. Oh well, it still came out great, and I fixed it on the next board. I drilled a hole in the corner to run the USB power strip underneath the board and tested it out. Thinking back, I could have just finished this with a clear finish and kept the natural look, and it would have been great. But at the time, I was wanting a darker board. I applied a hefty layer of Minwax wood finish to the sides of the frame and to the edging of the board. As you can see, I taped the edging trying to create a part dark finish, part natural wood corner to the edging. I thought it would be a neat design. That didn't work. Apparently, blue tape doesn't stop Minwax from seeping along the grain of the wood. Oh well, a little touch-up finish covered the tape gaps. For good measure, I cleaned the board with acetone and added a final top coat so that the epoxy and edging would all be covered and consistently shiny. Once dry, I sanded the drips from the bottom and added a coat of shellac to preserve the wood. Now it was time to fix my less than perfect 45-degree corners. I cut out 4 rectangles from a spare piece of walnut and decided to use them as pillars on the 4 corners. If you can't be good, at least be creative in fixing all of your screw-ups. I then cut slots out of the 4 corners of the frame, taking roughly 1 inch off, but making sure not to cut into the light strips. I marked the pieces with the best looking grain to face outward, sanded them down, and then glued them into the 4 corners of the frame. I finished the entire frame with a coat of shellac. Once dried, I did a light sanding and then did a second layer of shellac to assure that the frame was smooth. Well, that's it. Here's the final board. I think it came out pretty good even with all the hiccups along the way. I was very proud of the final piece. I hope you enjoyed the build, and if so, please like and subscribe. I've got a bunch of new videos being processed and coming out soon. One of them will even walk you through how I made these custom chess pieces for the final light-up board. Well, I'm checking out now, mate. See you soon.